I still remember the shock that washed over me the first time I overheard my mother's chilling words. It was a warm Sunday afternoon in our family home in Westbrook, the kind of day where sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows and cast long shadows across the hardwood floors. Mom thought I was out with friends, but I'd returned early, my footsteps silent on the carpet as I walked through the hallway. That's when I heard her voice, unnaturally sweet and persuasive, coming from the living room. "James, darling, I've been thinking," she said to my fiancé. I froze, my hand on the wall, my breath caught in my throat. Emily is so young, so inexperienced. But Sarah, she has such grace, such poise. She's always been the stronger one, don't you think? Sarah, my younger sister. The one who always got the better grades, the better looks, the better everything, at least according to our mother. "I'm not sure what you're suggesting, Mrs. Thompson," James replied, his voice uncertain. My heart began to race. James and I had been engaged for 6 months. We'd met at university, fallen in love over coffee and late-night study sessions, and he'd proposed on a rainy evening outside the library where we first bumped into each other. He wasn't perfect, but he was mine. Or so I thought. "I'm suggesting that perhaps you've chosen the wrong sister," my mother continued, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Sarah has always admired you, you know. And she would make such a lovely bride." The venom of betrayal seeped into every fiber of my being. I stood there, paralyzed, as my mother continued to list all the ways my sister outshone me, all the reasons James would be better off with her. And the worst part? James didn't immediately shut her down. He listened. He actually seemed to be considering it. I backed away, my vision blurring with tears, and slipped out the front door without making a sound. I wandered the streets of Westbrook for hours, past the old clock tower where we used to play as kids, past the high school where Sarah was always the star, past all the places that suddenly felt alien and hostile. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying the conversation in my head. Had there been signs I'd missed? Had Sarah and James exchanged glances behind my back? Had my mother been planning this all along? The next morning, I confronted James. We met at Rosie's Cafe, our usual spot for Sunday brunch. The familiar smell of pancakes and coffee couldn't mask the tension between us. "Did my mother talk to you yesterday?" I asked, my voice steadier than I expected. James looked down at his coffee cup, avoiding my eyes. "Emily, it wasn't like that. Just tell me the truth," I said, my hands clenched around my mug to stop them from shaking. "She did suggest that maybe Sarah and I would be a better match." He finally looked up at me, his blue eyes conflicted. "But I told her I love you." "Did you?" I asked. "Because you didn't sound very convinced yesterday." His face paled. "You heard?" "Every word," I said. The cafe chatter around us faded away, and all I could hear was the pounding of my own heart. "And you didn't defend me. You didn't tell her she was wrong or that you chose me for a reason." I was caught off guard, James protested. "Your mother can be intimidating, you know that." But I could see it in his eyes' doubt. Had my mother planted a seed, or had it been there all along, waiting for someone to water it? Over the next few weeks, I noticed the change. James started finding excuses to visit my family without me. Sarah began dressing differently, wearing makeup styles that I'd shown her, laughing at inside jokes with James that excluded me. And my mother watched it all with a satisfied smile, like a chess player seeing her strategy unfold exactly as planned. I confronted Sarah one evening. We were in the bedroom we'd shared growing up, surrounded by the remnants of our childhood, her cheerleading trophies, my books, the matching teddy bears we'd received on our 10th birthday. "Are you trying to steal my fiancé?" I asked bluntly. Sarah had the decency to look ashamed, at least for a moment. "It's not stealing if he wants to come to me, Em." "So you admit it?" My voice cracked. This was my sister, my flesh and blood, the person who'd helped me through my first heartbreak, who'd sat with me through the night when Dad left us. "Mom thinks it's for the best," she said, as if that justified everything. "You're too sensitive, too bookish. James needs someone who can keep up with his social life, someone who isn't me." I finished for her. She didn't deny it. The betrayal was not just in her words, but in the realization that the people I trusted most, my mother, my sister, my fiancé, had conspired against my happiness. It was like discovering that the ground beneath your feet isn't solid at all, but quicksand, ready to swallow you whole. I spent countless nights in solitude after that, replaying every moment that led to this devastating revelation. Every memory of warmth turned to ice. The family dinners where my mother subtly praised Sarah while critiquing my choices. The times James had mentioned how full of life my sister was. The way Sarah always managed to be around when James visited, always managed to look her best. I began to see the world with wounded eyes. People on the street, were they laughing at me too? Friends who asked about wedding plans, did they know what was happening behind closed doors? Every interaction felt tainted by suspicion and hurt. The initial shock soon transformed into a burning determination. I could not let this injustice define me, nor could I allow my pain to be dismissed. Deep within, I vowed to reclaim my dignity and exact the revenge that I believed was the only path to reclaiming my identity. I would not go quietly. I would not be replaced. I would not let them rewrite my story to cast me as the expendable one, the forgettable sister who couldn't hold on to her man. No, I would show them all that Emily Thompson was not to be underestimated. And so began my transformation, from betrayed fiancé to architect of my own justice. The path ahead would be dark and lonely, but I was already alone. And in that solitude, I found a strange kind of strength, a resolve that would carry me through the bitter days to come. After discovering the conspiracy between my mother, sister, and fiancé, I retreated into myself. The world around me continued to spin, but I felt disconnected from it all, like watching a movie about someone else's life. Spring blossomed in Westbrook, cherry trees lining Henderson Avenue erupted in pink clouds, but I barely noticed. I called in sick to my job at the local library for a week, then 2. Mrs. Finley, my supervisor and mentor since college, stopped by with soup and concern in her eyes. "Emily, whatever's happening, you can talk to me," she said, sitting at my kitchen table while I stared out the window. "This isn't like you." But how could I explain? How could I tell her that my entire life was unraveling thread by thread? That every time my phone buzzed with a text from James, increasingly infrequent, my stomach knotted with dread and hope? "I just need some time," I told her, forcing a smile that felt like it might crack my face. The days that followed were a tumultuous blur of emotions. I withdrew completely, turning down invitations from friends, ignoring calls from family. My apartment became my fortress and my prison. The silence around me was deafening, and every moment felt like an eternity of sorrow and betrayal. My best friend Megan tried to pull me out of my shell. She showed up one Saturday morning with bagels and coffee, determination written across her freckled face. "Get dressed," she ordered. "We're going out." "I'm not in the mood, Meg," I replied, wrapped in the same bathrobe I'd been wearing for days. "I don't care. This pity party has gone on long enough." She yanked open my curtains, letting harsh sunlight flood the room. "What happened? Did you and James have a fight?" I laughed, a hollow sound that surprised even me. "No, we didn't have a fight. My mother and sister are just trying to steal him from me, that's all. And he's letting them." Megan's face fell. "What? Are you serious?" I told her everything then, the words pouring out like a dam had broken. About the conversation I'd overheard, about Sarah's admission, about James's growing distance. Megan listened, her expression shifting from shock to outrage. "That's messed up," she said when I finished. "Have you confronted James directly? Like, all cards on the table?" I shook my head. What's the point? If he can be swayed so easily, then he never really loved me to begin with. Maybe, Megan conceded. Or maybe he's being manipulated too. Your mom can be pretty convincing when she wants something. That was true. My mother, Caroline Thompson, had always been a force of nature. After my father left when I was 12, she'd single-handedly managed our household, worked full-time as a real estate agent, and still found time to cultivate the perfect image of a successful single mother. She was respected in Westbrook, known for her charity work and impeccable taste. No one saw the calculating woman behind the facade, the one who played favorites and held grudges like precious gemstones. It doesn't matter, I said. I can't trust any of them now. Megan stayed for a while longer, but eventually she left too, promising to check on me the next day. I didn't respond. The truth was, I wanted to be alone. In the solitude of my apartment, I pored over old letters and mementos, searching for any trace of the love and trust that I once had. I found a shoebox filled with notes James had written me during our first year together, little scraps of paper with inside jokes, grocery lists with heart doodles in the margins, a napkin where he'd scribbled "I love you" after our first big fight. Each relic of the past only served to remind me of what I had lost and fueled my desire for retribution. The pain was raw and unyielding, carving deep scars that I feared would never heal. One night, in a fit of anger and grief, I drove past my mother's house. It was late, past midnight, but lights still shone in the kitchen. I parked across the street and watched as shadows moved behind the curtains. 3 shadows. My mother, my sister, and, unmistakably, James. They were laughing, glasses raised in what appeared to be a toast. The betrayal was complete. I drove home in a fog of pain, barely aware of the road before me. When I arrived, I pulled out my phone and finally did what I'd been avoiding for weeks. I checked social media. Sarah's Instagram told the story in pictures, her and James at a farmer's market, at a concert, at our mother's favorite restaurant. The captions were carefully vague, but their body language wasn't. They were a couple now, or nearly there. The comments under the photos were worse. Friends and neighbors expressing surprise, asking discreet questions. A few defended me, "Isn't he Emily's fiancé?" But most simply liked the posts, accepting this new reality without question. Even Mrs. Pemberton, my third-grade teacher who had always favored me over Sarah, had left a heart emoji under a picture of them at the lake. It felt like the entire town of Westbrook was complicit in my humiliation. Had everyone known what was happening except me? Had they been whispering behind my back, pitying poor Emily who couldn't keep her man? But in that darkest solitude, as I scrolled through evidence of my own replacement, something shifted inside me. The bitterness in my heart slowly transformed into a fierce resolve. I recognized that the only way to emerge from this abyss was to harness the pain and channel it into a pursuit for justice, justice not only for me, but also for the truth that had been so callously distorted. I created a new folder on my laptop labeled Evidence and began taking screenshots. Every public interaction between Sarah and James, every comment, every sign that my mother was orchestrating this entire scenario. I wasn't sure what I would do with this information yet, but documenting it made me feel less helpless, less crazy. Then I found something unexpected, a message from Ben, James's cousin, expressing concern. "This doesn't seem right, man," he'd written under one photo. "Emily deserves better than this. We all knew you were just with her to get closer to her family's connections, but this is cold." I read the comment 3 times, my heart pounding. Connections? What connections? My family was comfortable but hardly influential. Then I remembered my mother's brother, Uncle Robert, was a partner at Stanford and Reed, the law firm where James hoped to work after passing the bar exam. Was that what this had all been about? Had James been using me all along to get closer to my uncle, and now my mother and sister were offering him a more direct route? The realization hit me like a physical blow. If true, this wasn't just a betrayal of the heart, but a calculated deception from the very beginning. The thought made me physically ill, and I spent the rest of the night curled around the toilet, purging myself of trust and innocence. When morning came, I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror, pale, hollow-eyed, but somehow stronger. The woman staring back at me wasn't the same naive girl who had accepted James's proposal with tears of joy. This woman had eyes that saw clearly now, that recognized manipulation and selfishness for what they were. "Enough," I whispered to my reflection. "No more hiding. No more crying." I showered for the first time in days, dressed in clean clothes, and made myself a proper breakfast. As I ate, a plan began to take shape in my mind, not just for revenge, but for reclaiming my dignity, for exposing the truth to everyone who had written me off. The wedding was still scheduled for June 15th at St. Mark's Church. Invitations had gone out months ago. As far as anyone knew, James and I were still engaged. No official announcement had been made otherwise. That gave me 6 weeks to prepare for the day that would change everything, not just for me, but for everyone who had underestimated Emily Thompson. With every passing day, my mind crafted a labyrinthine plan of retribution. No longer the weeping victim huddled in my apartment, I emerged into the world with new purpose. I returned to work at the library, smiled at neighbors, and pretended that everything was fine. All the while, I was taking careful notes, collecting evidence, and laying groundwork for what was to come. The first step was information gathering. I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with. One Tuesday afternoon, I visited Uncle Robert at his law office in downtown Westbrook. The Stanford and Reed building loomed over Main Street, all glass and steel, a testament to power and influence. Emily, Uncle Robert's face lit up when I was shown into his office. Unlike my mother, he had always treated me with genuine affection. What a pleasant surprise. How's the wedding planning going? I forced a bright smile. That's actually why I'm here. I was hoping to talk to you about James. Wonderful young man, Robert said, gesturing for me to sit. He's got a bright future ahead of him. Has he contacted you about a position at the firm? I asked, trying to sound casual. Robert's bushy eyebrows rose. He has, as a matter of fact. Your mother mentioned he'd be a good fit here. I've scheduled an interview with him next week. Why do you ask? Just curious about our future plans, I said. Mom seems very invested in his career. Caroline has always had an eye for potential, Robert replied with a chuckle. She mentioned that James and Sarah have been working on some kind of project together. Something about the Thompson family history. My stomach tightened. So that was the cover story they were using for all the time they spent together. Clever. Yes, I said, maintaining my smile. They've been very dedicated to it. We chatted a bit longer, and when I left, my suspicions were confirmed. James was using my family connections to secure his future, and my mother was facilitating it, with Sarah as the prize instead of me. The question was, why? What did my mother gain from the switcheroo? The answer came 2 days later when I accidentally encountered my mother's best friend, Diane Whitley, at the Westbrook Community Garden. Diane had been like an aunt to me growing up, but her loyalty was ultimately to my mother. Emily, sweetheart. Diane embraced me, smelling of soil and expensive perfume. I haven't seen you in ages. Your mother says you've been busy with work. Of course, she'd make excuses for my absence rather than admit what was really happening. Very busy, I agreed. But I hear Mom's been busy too. Planning some big party? Diane's eyes gleamed with excitement. Oh, you know about that? Caroline wanted it to be a surprise, but I suppose the cat's out of the bag. Yes, she's planning a fundraiser gala for the hospital board. She's determined to secure that chairperson position, and having a successful lawyer in the family would certainly help her networking efforts. And there it was. My mother's ambition had always been to climb higher in Westbrook's social circles. The hospital board chairperson was a prestigious position, one that would give her exactly the status and influence she craved. A daughter married to a promising attorney from a respected firm would be much more useful to her than a daughter married to a struggling new lawyer with no connections. I thanked Diane and left, my mind racing. The puzzle pieces were falling into place. I wasn't just being replaced because Sarah was better. Somehow, I was being sacrificed for my mother's social ambitions. That evening, I meticulously reviewed every bit of evidence I'd gathered. James's cousin Ben might be willing to speak up if pushed. There were the messages and photos on social media showing the timeline of betrayal. There was Uncle Robert's confirmation about the job interview and my mother's involvement. And, most damning of all, there was the original conversation I'd overheard, the one where my mother had first suggested to James that he choose Sarah instead of me. But would exposing all this be enough? Would it truly make them understand the depth of what they'd done to me? I needed something more, something that would ensure this betrayal would haunt them forever. The idea came to me in the middle of the night. I woke up suddenly, heart pounding, with perfect clarity about what needed to be done. My wedding was the key. Everyone in Westbrook would be there. Family, friends, colleagues, the town's most influential citizens. What better stage for the truth to be revealed? I began to gather evidence of the manipulation and deceit that had haunted my life. Every whispered conversation, every clandestine meeting, and every smile shared by those who betrayed me became a piece of the puzzle. I documented every instance, knowing that truth would be my weapon against them all. But I needed an ally, someone who could help me execute the final phase of my plan. Someone who had no loyalty to my mother and who would understand why this was necessary. I thought of Megan, but her gentle nature would balk at such dramatic confrontation. Then I remembered Ryan Bennett. Ryan had dated Sarah briefly in high school before she abruptly dumped him for the captain of the football team. He'd been devastated, and rumors suggested that my mother had encouraged the breakup, considering Ryan's family not good enough, despite their respected position in Westbrook. Now Ryan was back in town after college, working at his father's architecture firm and, according to local gossip, still harboring resentment toward the Thompsons. I invited him for coffee at a cafe on the outskirts of town, away from prying eyes. He arrived looking curious and slightly wary. "Emily Thompson," he said, sliding into the booth across from me. "Been a while. You look different." "Life changes you," I replied. "Sometimes for the better." "I heard about your engagement," Ryan said, stirring his coffee. "Congratulations. That's what I wanted to talk to you about, actually." I leaned forward. "How would you feel about helping me get some justice for the way my family treated you?" His eyebrows shot up. "I'm listening." I laid out my situation, exposing the betrayal I'd experienced. Ryan's expression darkened as I spoke, old wounds clearly reopening. "Your mother always was a piece of work," he said when I finished. "But your sister?" I thought she was just young and impressionable back then. Turns out the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. "Will you help me?" I asked. "I need someone to handle the technical aspects of what I'm planning." Ryan studied me for a long moment. "What exactly do you have in mind?" I explained my plan for the wedding day. His eyes widened, then a slow smile spread across his face. "That's either the most brilliant or the most insane thing I've ever heard," he said. "Either way, I'm in." Over the next few weeks, Ryan and I worked together in secret. He used his technical skills to help me compile and format the evidence in a way that would be undeniable. We created backup plans for every contingency. We rehearsed the timing until it was perfect. Meanwhile, I maintained the facade of the unsuspecting fiancé. I attended my own bridal shower, smiled through fittings for a dress I would never wear down the aisle, and pretended not to notice when James made excuses to avoid being alone with me. I even had dinner with my mother and sister, listening to them discuss wedding details while exchanging glances they thought I couldn't see. The roses for the centerpieces should be white, not cream, my mother insisted one evening, dabbing her lips with a napkin. White symbolizes purity, after all. Sarah nodded in agreement, not meeting my eyes. White is definitely better. I wanted to laugh at the irony, but kept my face carefully neutral. "Whatever you think is best, Mom." The more I planned, the clearer it became that my revenge was not merely about hurting them, it was about reclaiming my power and restoring my self-worth. I steeled myself for the confrontation, preparing both my heart and my mind for the battle that lay ahead. This was not the path of a defeated woman, but that of someone reborn from the ashes of betrayal. The night before the wedding, I couldn't sleep. My dress hung on the closet door, a beautiful ivory gown that had once represented dreams and now symbolized deception. I touched the delicate lace, remembering how excited I'd been when I first tried it on, how James had said he couldn't wait to see me in it. For a brief moment, doubt crept in. Was I taking this too far? Would this public exposure hurt innocent people who had nothing to do with the betrayal? But then I remembered the look on my mother's face when she'd suggested to James that my sister would make a better wife. I remembered Sarah's words, "It's not stealing if he wants to come to me." I remembered James's silence when he should have defended our relationship. No, they deserved to face the consequences of their actions. They deserved to feel even a fraction of the humiliation and pain they had inflicted on me. Tomorrow, the entire town of Westbrook would know exactly who they really were behind their perfect facades. I sent Ryan a text, "Everything ready for tomorrow?" His response came immediately, "All set." Operation Truth is a go. I put my phone away and looked around my apartment. I'd already packed the essentials. After tomorrow, I couldn't stay in Westbrook. The scandal would be too great, the whispers too loud. I had a job lined up in Boston, an apartment waiting, a new life ready to begin once this chapter closed. One more day, I whispered to myself, watching the moon cast shadows across my bedroom floor. One more day, and then you're free. June 15th dawned bright and clear, the kind of perfect summer day that wedding photographers dream about. Sunlight filtered through my bedroom blinds, waking me from a fitful sleep. For a moment, I lay still, trying to calm my racing heart. Today was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. Instead, it would be the day I burned my old life to the ground. I checked my phone, a text from Ryan confirming he was in position, another from Megan asking if I needed help getting ready. I replied to both, then forced myself out of bed. The morning stretched before me, hours to fill before the 2 p.m. ceremony at St. Mark's Church. I took my time showering, letting hot water wash away the last traces of doubt. As I dried my hair, I stared at my reflection, pale but composed, eyes clear and focused. I applied my makeup carefully, choosing a natural look rather than the dramatic style my mother had insisted upon. This was my day, after all, even if not in the way anyone expected. The dress waited, a silent accusation of dreams deferred. I slipped it on alone, feeling the weight of ivory satin and lace settle around me. It fit perfectly, of course. My mother had made sure of that. Caroline Thompson would never allow her daughter to look anything less than flawless, even the daughter she was betraying. The doorbell rang at noon. Outside stood Megan, dressed in the sage green bridesmaid dress we'd chosen together months ago. "Oh, she breathed when she saw me. "You look stunning." "Thanks," I said, letting her in. "Is everything ready at the church?" Megan nodded, her expression growing serious. "Your mom's been there since dawn, micromanaging every detail. Sarah's with her." She hesitated. "Are you sure about this?" "It's not too late to call it off quietly." "I'm sure," I replied, my voice steady. "They need to face what they've done." The drive to St. Mark's passed in tense silence. As we approached the church, I could see guests arriving, women in colorful dresses and men in dark suits filing into the historic stone building that had hosted Westbrook weddings for over a century. My wedding. Except it wasn't really mine anymore, was it? We parked in the back, using the side entrance to avoid being seen. In the small antechamber designated for the bride, my mother waited, resplendent in a designer dress the exact shade of blue that complemented her ash blonde hair. "Emily!" "Finally," she exclaimed, rushing forward to adjust my veil. We were beginning to worry. "The photographer wants to start the pre-ceremony shots." I allowed her to fuss over me, watching her with detached curiosity. Did she feel any guilt at all? Any hesitation about what she'd orchestrated? "Where's Sarah?" I asked, my voice carefully neutral. "Helping the flower girls with their baskets," my mother replied, not meeting my eyes. Such a natural with children, that girl. Of course. Another dig, another reminder of why Sarah was the superior choice. I bit my tongue. The next hour passed in a blur of photographs, last-minute adjustments, and forced smiles. I played my part perfectly, the blushing bride-to-be, while texting Ryan updates whenever I could slip away. The church filled with guests, over 200 of Westbrook's finest citizens, many invited more for my mother's social aspirations than any genuine connection to me or James. At 1:45, my mother gathered the bridal party. "Places, everyone. Emily, you wait here with your uncle. He'll walk you down when the music changes." Uncle Robert appeared, dapper in his tuxedo, offering his arm with a warm smile. "Ready, kiddo?" "Almost," I said. "Can I have a minute alone first?" "Just to collect myself." My mother started to protest, but Uncle Robert nodded. "Of course. Take all the time you need." When they left, I quickly pulled out my phone and texted Ryan. "Now." His response came immediately. "Done." I took a deep breath, smoothed my dress, and opened the door. Uncle Robert waited patiently, offering his arm once more. "You look beautiful," he said, his eyes crinkling with genuine affection. "Your father would be proud." I wondered if he'd still think that in 20 minutes, but I smiled and took his arm. "Thank you for doing this." The music swelled, the traditional wedding march echoing through the vaulted ceiling of St. Mark's. The massive wooden doors opened, revealing the church in all its decorated glory. White roses and green foliage adorned every pew. Sunlight streamed through stained glass windows, casting rainbow patterns across the stone floor. And at the end of the aisle stood James, handsome in his tuxedo, his best man beside him. I scanned the crowd as Uncle Robert and I began our slow procession. Friends from college, neighbors, colleagues from the library, my mother's social circle, all turned to watch me with admiring smiles. Near the front, I spotted Sarah, stunning in her maid of honor dress, a shade of sage green slightly more flattering than the bridesmaids' dresses. Our eyes met briefly before she looked away, a flush spreading across her cheeks. The day of the wedding had arrived like a storm on the horizon, charged with anticipation and dark foreboding. Every step I took down that flower-strewn aisle was filled with the weight of my secret mission, and my heart beat in sync with the rhythm of retribution. Inside the ornate church, I could feel the tension that vibrated in the air. Family and friends gathered in a blend of solemnity and celebration, oblivious to the undercurrents of deceit. My fiancé and my younger sister stood side by side, their guilty expressions a stark reminder of the betrayal that had stolen my peace. As I approached the altar, James stepped forward to take my hand from Uncle Robert. His palm was sweaty, his smile strained. Did he think I knew? Was he planning to go through with this farce of a wedding, or was there some plan to jilt me at the altar? Perhaps he thought if he married me, he could continue pursuing my sister behind my back while securing his position at my uncle's firm. The possibilities made my stomach turn. "Dearly beloved," began Reverend Marshall, his deep voice resonating through the church. "We are gathered here today in the sight of God and these witnesses to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony." I half listened to the familiar words, keeping track of time in my head. Ryan had been precise about the timing. Any minute now. Reverend Marshall continued through the ceremony, speaking of love and trust and honesty with no apparent irony. James squeezed my hand occasionally, his eyes darting nervously to where my mother sat in the front row. I maintained my serene smile, the perfect picture of a bride in love. "Marriage is not to be entered into lightly," the Reverend intoned, but reverently and soberly. "If anyone can show just cause why these two should not be joined in holy matrimony, speak now or forever hold your peace." A hush fell over the congregation. This was traditionally a symbolic pause, a moment of ceremony never actually interrupted. But today would be different. 3, 2, 1. Right on cue, the massive screen that had been set up to display a photo montage during the reception suddenly flickered to life behind the altar. My mother had insisted on having it installed for her speech, wanting everyone to see the carefully curated images of James and me, though I now suspected she'd planned to include plenty of Sarah as well. But instead of romantic photos, the screen displayed text messages. Dozens of them, blown up for all to see, scrolling slowly enough for everyone to read. Messages between James and Sarah, arranging secret meetings. Messages between my mother and James, discussing his future at the firm if he made the right choice. Messages from Sarah to her friends, bragging about stealing my fiancé with our mother's blessing. A collective gasp rose from the congregation. I heard my mother's sharp intake of breath, saw James's face drain of color. Sarah let out a small cry of dismay, her hand flying to her mouth. I moved through the stunned crowd like a ghost, my mind a swirling vortex of memories and determination. Each step brought me closer to the moment I had been waiting for, the moment when the truth would no longer be suppressed by lies. I knew that this day would mark the turning point of my life, whether it ended in ruin or redemption. Reverend Marshall stared at the screen in confusion, then at me, then at James. What is the meaning of this? The timing was perfect. As if in answer to his question, the church doors flew open with a bang. Ryan stood there, tablet in hand, clearly controlling the display. Our eyes met across the church, and he gave me a slight nod. My cue. I turned to face the congregation, my voice clear and steady in the shocked silence. "I believe," I said, that this qualifies as just cause. As the priest's voice resonated through the church, time seemed to slow down. 200 pairs of eyes swiveled from the incriminating messages on the screen to me, standing in my wedding dress at the altar. My pulse quickened as I realized that this was the moment I had meticulously planned for. With every ounce of strength, I stepped away from James, moving to the center of the aisle where everyone could see me clearly. "I'd like to thank you all for coming today," I began, my voice steadier than I'd expected. "You were invited to witness a union of love and trust. Unfortunately, what you're actually witnessing is the culmination of betrayal, manipulation, and lies." The church was so silent you could hear the ancient heating system creaking in the basement. James took a step toward me, his hand outstretched. "Emily, please," he started, his voice cracking. "No." I held up my hand, stopping him in his tracks. "You've had months to speak up, James. Now it's my turn." I turned back to the congregation, scanning the rows of shocked faces. Friends from elementary school, teachers who had watched me grow up, colleagues from the library, neighbors who had known my family for generations, all of them witnesses to my most painful moment and, I hoped, my most powerful one. 3 months ago, I overheard a conversation between my mother and my fiancé. A conversation in which she suggested that he would be better off marrying my sister instead of me. I looked directly at my mother, who sat rigid in the front pew, her face a mask of fury and embarrassment. A conversation in which she made it clear that Sarah was the superior choice, the daughter who would help advance her social standing in Westbrook, the one who could help her secure a position on the hospital board. Murmurs rippled through the church. My mother rose halfway from her seat, then sank back down as Uncle Robert placed a restraining hand on her arm, his expression thunderous as he stared at his sister. I thought, at first, that this was just my mother being, well, herself. A few nervous chuckles from those who knew Caroline Thompson's manipulative tendencies. But then I discovered that this wasn't a spur-of-the-moment suggestion. This was a calculated plan that had been in motion for weeks, possibly months. A plan in which my sister, I looked at Sarah, who was staring at the floor, tears streaming down her face, was a willing participant. I gestured to Ryan, who tapped his tablet. The screen behind me changed to display a series of photos, Sarah and James at various locations around Westbrook, their body language intimate and telling. Then a screenshot of an email from my mother to the head of the hospital board, hinting at her soon-to-be lawyer son-in-law and the connections he would bring to the Thompson family. But the betrayal goes deeper than that, I continued, my voice growing stronger with each word. You see, James wasn't just being persuaded to switch from one sister to another for my mother's social ambitions. He was using us all to secure a position at Stanford and Reed through my uncle. I looked at James, whose face had gone from pale to ashen. Isn't that right, James? That was the end goal all along, wasn't it? Dating me was just a means to an end. In that charged silence, I spoke the words that I had rehearsed countless times in the solitude of my despair. I recounted the hidden truths, exposing the deception and manipulation that had led to this tragic union. Every word was a dagger, slicing through the veneer of pretense and igniting a blaze of truth that no one could ignore. I recently discovered messages between James and his cousin Ben, I said, as Ryan displayed these on the screen. Messages in which James admits that he pursued me specifically to get closer to my family's connections. Messages in which he complained about having to pretend interest in my boring library job and my endless book discussions. A collective intake of breath from the congregation. I saw Mrs. Finley from the library shake her head in disgust. So when my mother suggested that he might prefer my more socially adept sister, James saw an opportunity. Why settle for the bookish older daughter when he could have the vivacious younger one and still get the job he wanted? After all, Sarah looks better in photos for the society pages, doesn't she, Mom? My mother finally found her voice. This is outrageous, she hissed, standing up. You're embarrassing yourself and our family with these wild accusations. Are they wild? I asked, raising an eyebrow. I nodded to Ryan, who tapped his tablet again. My mother's voice filled the church, crystal clear from the hidden recording I'd made during our last dinner together. Once you're married, we'll need to work on Emily's image. That library job will have to go. No daughter-in-law of Caroline Thompson can be shelving books for minimum wage. And we'll need to do something about her wardrobe. Sarah, you'll have to help her. You've always had a better sense of style. More gasps, more murmurs. My mother sank back into her seat, her face now drained of color. I've spent the last 6 weeks discovering just how deep this conspiracy goes, I said, addressing the congregation once more. How many of you were told that I was difficult about the wedding plans? That I was too busy to attend functions? That I was happy to let my mother and sister handle everything? I saw recognition dawn on several faces. The truth is, I was deliberately excluded while the 3 people I trusted most worked to replace me in my own life. The shock on every face was palpable, and even Reverend Marshall seemed paralyzed by the revelation. My declaration resonated through the sacred space, shattering the illusion of love and unity. It was a moment of catharsis, a fierce confrontation that forced every heart present to face the ugly reality of betrayal and the high cost of silence. James finally stepped forward, his lawyer's instincts kicking in despite his obvious shock. Emily, this isn't the place for this kind of, isn't it? I interrupted. What better place than a church, where people pledge honesty before God? What better time than a wedding, where vows of fidelity are about to be made? What better audience than the entire town of Westbrook, who have been watching this charade unfold for months? Sarah suddenly stood up, her face streaked with tears. It wasn't supposed to happen like this, she said, her voice breaking. I never meant to hurt you, Em. It just happened. A hollow laugh escaped me. Things like this don't just happen, Sarah. They're chosen, step by step, betrayal by betrayal. I looked around the church, meeting the eyes of friends and neighbors who had known me all my life. My sister chose to pursue my fiancé behind my back. My mother chose to facilitate it for her own ambitions. And James, I turned to him, seeing him clearly for the first time in months. James chose his career over honesty, over integrity, over love. Mrs. Pemberton, my old teacher, suddenly stood up from her pew. I always thought it was strange when Sarah started showing up at community events with James, she said loudly. Caroline told me you were working late nights at the library. I was at home, I replied, believing my fiancé was working late at his office. Turns out he was dating my sister with my mother's blessing. More voices joined in, more people standing to speak. The dam had broken, and all the whispers, all the rumors, all the uncomfortable observations that no one had been willing to voice were suddenly pouring out. Mrs. Finley confirmed that. I hadn't been working extra shifts. Ben, James's cousin, reluctantly admitted that James had spoken of my family connections before he ever mentioned loving me. Through it all, my mother, Sarah, and James remained frozen, watching their carefully constructed narrative collapse around them. The shock on their faces would have been satisfying if the whole situation weren't so painfully sad. Finally, Uncle Robert stood up. The church quieted immediately. Robert Thompson's influence in Westbrook commanded that kind of respect. Is this true, Caroline? He asked, his voice cutting through the tension. Did you orchestrate this travesty? My mother lifted her chin, her composure partially regained. I was only thinking of what was best for the family, she said stiffly. Emily has always been difficult. Sarah and James have a natural compatibility that, stop. Uncle Robert's voice was like a whip crack. I've heard enough. He turned to James. Needless to say, Mr. Patterson, your interview at Stanford and Reed is canceled. I suggest you avoid mentioning my name in any future job applications. James paled even further. This, more than anything else, seemed to hit him the hardest, the realization that his career ambitions, the very reason he'd engaged in this deception, were now in tatters. I looked at the 3 of them, my mother, my sister, my ex-fiancé, and felt a strange mix of vindication and sorrow. They had hurt me deeply, had conspired to rewrite my life without my consent. But standing there, exposed before the entire community, they suddenly seemed smaller somehow. Less intimidating. Less powerful. I came here today, I said, my voice quieter now, not just to expose what was done to me, but to reclaim my dignity. To show Westbrook, and myself, that Emily Thompson will not be silently replaced, will not be manipulated, will not be erased. I reached up and removed my veil, letting it drift to the floor. The symbolic gesture wasn't lost on anyone present. There will be no wedding today, I announced. But the truth has been spoken, and for that, I am grateful to all of you for bearing witness. With those words, I turned and walked back down the aisle, head high, eyes forward. No one tried to stop me. No one spoke. The only sound was the rustle of my wedding dress and the distant call of birds outside the church windows. As I reached the doors, Ryan fell into step beside me, a small smile of approval on his face. Together, we stepped out into the bright June sunshine, leaving behind the shattered remains of lies and deception in the cool darkness of St. Mark's Church. In the wake of that fateful moment, the church was engulfed in chaos. I didn't witness it myself, but Megan told me later that after I left, the stunned silence erupted into a cacophony of voices. Some defended me, others criticized my public exposure of family matters. My mother apparently tried to salvage the situation, claiming I was suffering from pre-wedding hysteria and making up stories, but the evidence on the screen was irrefutable. The wedding was abruptly canceled, and whispers of shock and sorrow filled the air. I stood on the church steps, the June sunlight warm on my face, feeling an unexpected sense of relief as the veil of deception was finally lifted from my life. Ryan stood beside me, car keys dangling from his fingers. "Ready to go?" he asked. I nodded, suddenly eager to be anywhere but Westbrook. We had already loaded my essential belongings into his car that morning, a suitcase of clothes, a box of books, my laptop, and a few precious mementos uncorrupted by recent events. Everything else could be replaced. We drove in companionable silence through town, passing familiar streets that now felt like relics from someone else's life. As we reached the "Leaving Westbrook" sign, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. The future stretched before me, uncertain but undeniably mine. "Where to?" Ryan asked as we approached the highway. "Boston," I replied. "I have an apartment waiting and a job interview on Monday." He grinned. "Look at you, all prepared." "I'm impressed." "I learned from the best," I said wryly, thinking of my mother's meticulous planning abilities, now turned against her. We made it to Boston by evening. Ryan helped me carry my belongings up to the small but bright apartment I'd rented in Cambridge, conveniently located near several libraries and universities. It was a fresh start, a blank page waiting to be filled with my own choices, my own story. "You going to be okay?" Ryan asked as he prepared to leave. That was quite a day. I smiled, surprising myself with how genuine it felt. "I think I am, actually. For the first time in months, I feel like I can breathe." After Ryan left, I stood in the center of my new living room, surrounded by boxes and unfamiliar walls. My phone had been buzzing incessantly since we left Westbrook, calls from my mother, from Sarah, from James, from curious friends and neighbors. I turned it off. Whatever they had to say could wait until I was ready to hear it, if ever. In the days that followed, the fallout was as overwhelming as it was transformative. Megan called from Westbrook with updates, using her landline since I wasn't answering my cell. The scandal had rocked our small town, she reported. James had fled back to his parents' home in Portsmouth. Sarah had locked herself in her bedroom, refusing to speak to anyone. And my mother, Caroline Thompson, always the picture of social grace, had been conspicuously absent from her usual haunts. "Mrs. Pemberton is organizing a care package for you," Megan said. "And Mrs. Finley wants you to know your job at the library is still yours if you want it." The kindness touched me, but I knew I couldn't go back. Westbrook held too many painful memories now, too many people who had seen me at my most vulnerable and vengeful moment. "Tell them thank you," I said. "But I need a fresh start." My interview at the Boston Public Library went well. The head librarian, Dr. Winters, was impressed by my experience and enthusiasm. When she asked why I'd left my previous position, I gave her a simplified version of the truth, family complications that necessitated a move. She didn't press for details, and I was grateful. "We could use someone with your cataloging skills," Dr. Winters said. "When can you start?" "Tomorrow," I replied eagerly. Working helped ground me during those first tumultuous weeks. I threw myself into learning the new system, meeting colleagues, and finding my place in the grand old library with its marble staircases and domed reading rooms. The rhythm of books being checked out and returned, the quiet conversations with patrons seeking recommendations, the peaceful task of organizing knowledge, all of it soothed my battered spirit. I found an unexpected ally in Olivia Chin, the library's digital resources coordinator. She was about my age, with a quick wit and zero tolerance for drama. We bonded over lunch breaks spent discussing everything from classic literature to the best cheap eats in Cambridge. "So what's your story?" she asked one day, a month after I'd started. "Everyone's got one." I hesitated, then decided on honesty. I left my hometown after exposing my fiancé for cheating with my sister and my mother for orchestrating the whole thing. At our wedding, in front of the entire town. Olivia's eyebrows shot up, then she burst out laughing. "Okay, that's definitely better than my moved for a job opportunity story. Details, please." Every single one. Talking about it with someone who had no connection to Westbrook, who knew none of the players involved, was surprisingly therapeutic. Olivia listened without judgment, occasionally interjecting with colorful commentary about what she'd like to do to James, Sarah, and my mother if she ever met them. "You know what this calls for?" she said when I finished. "A proper Boston night out. Dancing, drinks, cute strangers, the works." I protested weakly, but the next Friday found me at a crowded bar in Cambridge, surrounded by Olivia's diverse group of friends. They welcomed me without question, pulling me onto the dance floor, buying rounds of drinks, and filling the night with laughter and conversation that had nothing to do with betrayal or revenge. As weeks turned into months, I built a new life for myself brick by emotional brick. I joined a book club, started taking weekend photography classes, explored Boston's historic neighborhoods, and slowly allowed myself to trust again, not with the blind faith of before, but with careful consideration and clear boundaries. Family bonds were shattered, of course. My mother made several attempts to contact me, escalating from voicemails to certified letters. Her messages followed a predictable pattern: initial anger, "How could you humiliate us like that?" followed by justification, "I was only thinking of what was best for everyone," culminating in attempts at reconciliation. "We're still family, Emily." I read her letters, considered her words, then filed them away without response. Perhaps someday I would be ready to have that conversation, but the wounds were still too fresh, the betrayal too profound. Sarah was a different story. 6 months after the wedding that wasn't, she appeared at my apartment unannounced, looking thinner and older than I remembered. "Please," she said when I opened the door. "Just 5 minutes." I let her in, more out of curiosity than forgiveness. We sat awkwardly in my small living room, two sisters who now felt like strangers. "I'm sorry," she began, tears already forming. "I know that doesn't fix anything, but I need you to know that I regret what I did. Every day." "Why?" I asked, the question that had haunted me for months. "Why would you do that to me?" Sarah looked down at her hands. "It sounds so pathetic now, but I was jealous. You were always the smart one, the one with direction. You found James, this perfect guy with ambition and charm, and you were going to have this perfect life. And Mom, you know how she is." She kept pointing out how much better I could be for him, how much more I deserved a chance at happiness. "You deserved a chance at happiness, just not at my expense," I said quietly. She nodded, tears falling freely now. "I know that now. I lost my sister. James left town, Mom's a social pariah, and I'm the girl who tried to steal her sister's fiancé. Nobody wins." I didn't offer forgiveness that day, but I didn't slam the door on possibility either. "I need time," I told her as she left. "A lot of time." As for James, I heard through mutual acquaintances that he'd moved to Chicago, unable to secure a position at any prestigious New England firm after Uncle Robert's influence turned against him. I felt no satisfaction in his downfall, only a dull ache for what might have been if he'd been the man I thought he was. Looking back now, a year after that explosive day at St. Mark's, I realized that the pain and betrayal I experienced were catalysts for a profound transformation. The Emily who walked down that aisle in Westbrook was a different person than the woman I am today, stronger, wiser, more discerning about where I place my trust and my heart. Boston has become home now. My apartment is filled with books and photographs and mementos of new adventures. I've been promoted at the library, heading up a digital literacy program that helps seniors navigate the internet. I've made friends who know me for who I am now, not for the scandal that drove me from my hometown. And yes, I've even started dating again, cautiously, thoughtfully. His name is Daniel, a history professor at Boston University who came to one of my library workshops. He makes me laugh, challenges my thinking, and respects my boundaries. I've told him about my past, and he understands why trust comes slowly for me now. Everyone has scars, he said simply. They're proof we survived something difficult. I still think about that wedding day sometimes, not with regret, but with the understanding that it was necessary. My journey of revenge was not just about retribution. It was about rediscovering my true self and forging a future where honesty, justice, and self-respect reign supreme. The betrayal taught me painful but valuable lessons. That family doesn't always mean unconditional support. That love can be feigned for ulterior motives. That standing up for yourself sometimes means standing alone. But it also showed me my own resilience, my capacity to rebuild, and the freedom that comes with claiming your own narrative. I don't know if I'll ever return to Westbrook. Perhaps someday, when the memories have faded enough and the town has moved on to newer gossip. For now, I'm content with the life I've created for myself, a life built on my terms, shaped by my choices, and rich with possibilities that are entirely my own. My mother used to say that a lady never makes a scene. Well, I made the biggest scene Westbrook had ever witnessed, and it freed me. Sometimes the most ladylike thing you can do is to stand in your truth, even when, especially when, that truth is messy and painful and inconvenient for others. That day at St. Mark's, I didn't just expose a betrayal, I reclaimed my story. And every day since then, I've been writing new chapters, filling blank pages with adventures and challenges and moments of quiet joy that belong solely to me. No longer a supporting character in someone else's narrative, I am the author of my own life now. And that, more than any revenge, is the sweetest victory of all.